The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from Alara's bones and the final whimper from her son's chapped lips. It scoured the plains, a relentless predator that had already claimed the strength of their mare and the integrity of their wagon's rear axle. Now, stranded in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Nebraska Territory, it seemed poised to claim them, too. The sky was a bruised and swollen gray, promising a cold so deep it would freeze the very marrow. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. She huddled in the fractured shelter of the wagon bed, her own threadbare shawl wrapped around the tiny, still form of her baby, Leo. His silence was more terrifying than any cry. He had been born on the trail, a creature of dust and hope, but the hope had long since crumbled into the ruts of the path behind them. Her husband, who had promised her a new life under a kinder sun, was a ghost claimed by river fever 300 miles back, his memory now as thin and faded as the cheap map he'd left her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her world had shrunk to the cold reality of a cracked canteen holding only a few muddy drops and the failing warmth of her own body against her child's. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening for the faint, fluttery beat, a sound as fragile as a sparrow's wing. It was there, but it was slow, a weak and faltering drum against the howling orchestra of the wind. A tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and froze on her cheek. This was the end. A quiet, anonymous fading into the unforgiving landscape. Then, a shape on the horizon. At first, she thought it a trick of the wind, a dust devil or a mirage born of hunger. But it grew steadily, resolving into the distinct silhouette of a man on horseback. Fear, sharp and primal, lanced through her exhaustion. A lone rider in these parts was rarely a savior. He was more likely a scavenger, drawn to the scent of weakness. She pulled the shawl tighter around Leo, instinctively hiding him, making herself smaller. The rider moved with an unnerving economy of motion, his horse picking its way through the rough terrain with a sure-footed ease that spoke of long familiarity. He did not charge in but approached at a steady, measured pace, circling the broken wagon once as if assessing a fallen animal. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the punishing wind, shadowing his face. He drew his horse to a halt a dozen yards away, a respectful distance. He simply sat there for a long moment, watching. The silence between them was taut, broken only by the wind's mournful song and the creak of the ruined wagon. Alara held her breath, her heart a frantic hammer against her ribs. She could not see his eyes, but she felt his gaze, steady and unervingly perceptive. He dismounted, his movements fluid and unhurried. He was not a young man, but not old either. The land had carved deep lines into the parts of his face she could see, weathering him like old leather. He took a step forward, and she flinched, clutching Leo so tightly the baby stirred with a faint sigh. The man stopped instantly, raising a hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding in a riverbed, but it carried clearly on the wind. "You're in a bad way." It was not a question. It was a stark, unadorned fact. She said nothing, her throat sealed with dust and terror. He unslung a canteen from his saddle horn. He uncorked it and took a slow, deliberate drink himself before holding it out. Water. He took her silence not as refusal, but as caution. He walked slowly to the wagon and placed the canteen on the buckboard, then retreated to his horse, turning his back to her in a deliberate show of non-aggression. He busied himself checking his horse's tack, giving her the space to make a choice. Survival warred with suspicion. But the sight of the water, the dull gleam of the tin canteen, was a siren's call to her parched body. With trembling hands, she reached for it. The water was cool and clean, a shock of life against her cracked lips. She gave a few precious drops to Leo, who licked at them weakly. When she looked up, the man was watching her again, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He walked back, this time stopping closer. Axles split clear through. "Can't be mended here." He knelt, examining the wreckage with an expert's eye. Storm's coming. A bad 1 inch he stood and finally looked at her fully, and she saw his eyes. They were a startlingly pale gray, the color of the winter sky, and held a profound, weary calm. They held no judgment, no avarice. Only a quiet assessment of the facts. My place ain't far. A mile, maybe 2. It's warm. You and the boy will freeze out here, he wasn't asking. He was laying out the only option that didn't end in a shallow grave. He gestured to his horse. I can take you both. Elara looked from his stoic face to her helpless child, then at the vast, empty prairie that promised only death. The choice was not a choice at all. She gave a single, jerky nod. He retrieved a heavy wool blanket from his saddle roll and handed it to her without a word. He helped her mount his horse, his touch firm and impersonal on her elbow, then swung up behind her, taking the reins. He wrapped one strong arm around her and Leo, a solid wall against the biting wind. The horse started forward, and Elara leaned back against the stranger's chest, the scent of leather, wood smoke, and cold air filling her senses. She was a leaf caught in a current, surrendering to a force she could not fight, praying it was carrying her toward shelter, and not just a different kind of end. The cabin was more of a fortress against the elements than a home. It was built of thick, rough-hewn logs, chinked tightly with mud and grass, with a low roof and a single stone chimney that breathed a steady plume of gray smoke into the turbulent sky. Inside, it was Spartan and meticulously clean. A fire blazed in the hearth, its light dancing on the bare wooden walls. There was a simple cot in one corner, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a small area for cooking. It was a place built for solitude and survival, not comfort. The man, who she learned was named Silas, settled her in a chair by the fire, his movements efficient and devoid of fuss. He took Leo from her arms with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused hands cradling the baby's head with practiced care. He mixed a little warm water with a spoonful of precious canned milk he produced from a crate, and patiently fed the infant with the tip of his finger. Elara watched, a knot of exhausted emotion tightening in her throat. He moved with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and intimidating. He asked no questions about where she had come from or where she was going. He did not ask her name, nor did he offer his until she finally found her voice and asked. Silas, was all he said, before turning his attention back to stirring a pot of stew over the fire. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside, encasing the small cabin in a world of white fury. Inside, a quiet, fragile truce formed. Elara's time was measured by the rhythm of Leo's needs and the steady, unobtrusive presence of her rescuer. Silas spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He left a bowl of stew for her on the table and then retreated to the other side of the room to mend a piece of harness, giving her the privacy to eat. He kept the fire perpetually fed, ensuring the cabin remained a pocket of defiant warmth against the storm. He slept on a bedroll on the floor by the door, a silent guardian, leaving the only cot for her and the baby. Elara began to heal, the deep, bone-aching exhaustion slowly receding. She watched Silas, studying him in the flickering firelight. He was a man who seemed to have pared his life down to its barest essentials. There were no pictures, no letters, no traces of another life. There was only the cabin, his horse, and the vast, lonely land he inhabited. She saw the way he would pause in his work to watch Leo sleep, a flicker of something unreadable, sadness, perhaps, or a long-buried memory, in his gray eyes. One afternoon, while Silas was outside tending to his horse in the small, attached lean-to, she found a small, crudely carved wooden bird on the floor near the cot. It was smooth to the touch, its simple shape fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand. She knew, without needing to be told, that he had made it for Leo. The small, silent gesture of kindness undid her. It was a crack in the wall of his stoicism, a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. She began to contribute in small ways, asserting her presence in the silent space. She mended a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread from her own small sewing kit. She swept the hearth and kept the water bucket filled with melted snow. They were the small, domestic rituals of a life she thought she had lost forever, and they restored a piece of her dignity. They rarely spoke of anything beyond immediate necessities. Stew's ready. The wind is letting up. The boy has a good color now. Yet, in the shared silence, a deeper communication was taking place. It was in the way he would leave a dry log on the hearth just as she noticed the fire was dying, or the way she would have a cup of hot coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. It was a trust built not on words or promises, but on the steady accumulation of quiet, decent acts. She stopped seeing him as a potential threat and then as a mere rescuer. She began to see him as just Silas, a man as solitary and weathered as the landscape itself, who had offered her a moment of grace when the world had offered her none. The thaw came as abruptly as the storm. The world emerged, cleansed and glittering under a pale sun. The respite, however, was short-lived. Late one afternoon, as Alara was rocking Leo by the window, she saw them. 3 riders, dark figures against the blinding white snow. A cold, familiar dread seized her, far sharper than the fear she'd felt of Silas. These men rode with a swaggering arrogance she recognized. They were her late husband's brothers, men with cruelty etched into their faces and greed poisoning their hearts. They believed her husband had stolen a small inheritance, a pouch of gold coins meant to be shared, and they believed she had it. She had nothing, but they would never believe that. She turned from the window, her face ashen. Silas, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, saw the look in her eyes and instantly stood, his movements economical and deadly calm. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice flat. "They've found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They think I have money." Silas didn't need any more explanation. He glanced out the window, his jaw tightening. "Get in the corner, away from the door. Keep the boy quiet." His command was absolute, leaving no room for argument. He moved to the door, checking the sturdy bar he'd placed across it each night. The riders reined in, their loud voices and coarse laughter a violation of the cabin's profound silence. "Caleb, you in there?" one of them yelled, his voice thick with menace. "We know you've got our brother's woman. Send her out." Silas didn't answer. He stood beside the door, rifle held loosely in one hand, his body a study in lethal stillness. The quiet was more unnerving than any shouted threat. "Don't make us come in there, old man." The heavy thud of a boot against the door shook the cabin. Alara pressed herself into the corner, shielding Leo's body with her own, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Silas, his focus absolute. He was no longer just a quiet homesteader. He was a predator in his own territory, waiting. The shouting escalated, filled with vile threats against her and the child. Then came the splintering crash as a heavy log was used as a battering ram against the door. The wood groaned, holding, but the hinges shrieked in protest. Silas raised the rifle, sighting not at the door, but at the wall beside it. Another crash and the door bar splintered. As the door flew inward, a large, bearded man, the eldest brother, burst through, a pistol in his hand. Before he could even register the layout of the room, Silas's rifle cracked. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, staggering back, clutching a suddenly blood-soaked shoulder before collapsing into the snow outside. The other two, momentarily stunned, scrambled for cover. Silas didn't hesitate. He was already moving, a blur of motion as he stepped out into the blinding sunlight, using the doorway for cover. 2 more shots rang out in quick succession. One of the men screamed, a sharp, panicked sound. Then, silence, absolute and profound, descended once more. Alara remained frozen, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging her nostrils. After a long moment, Silas stepped back inside, closing the shattered remains of the door behind him. There was a dark, seeping stain on his sleeve and a grim set to his mouth, but his eyes, when they met hers, were steady. The threat was over. He had stood between her and the cruel world that had pursued her, and he had not flinched. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm had ever been. Outside, the remaining 2 men were gone, one nursing a wounded arm, their bravado shattered, leaving their injured brother groaning in the snow until he, too, managed to stumble away. Silas barred the broken door as best he could with a heavy crate, then sank onto a chair, the rifle resting across his knees. The adrenaline drained from Alara's body, leaving her weak and trembling. She looked at the blood on his sleeve, a dark blossom spreading on the coarse fabric. For the first time, she moved toward him not out of necessity or tentative gratitude, but with a fierce, protective urgency. She took a clean cloth and a bowl of warm water and knelt before him. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't protest. He watched her as she carefully cut away the sleeve and cleaned the deep gash on his forearm where a bullet had grazed him. Her touch was gentle, her focus intense. In that small, intimate act, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. This was not a stranger, not a rescuer. This was the man who had fed her child, who had built a wall of his own body around them. The man who had bled for them. When she finished bandaging the wound, her hands lingered on his arm. She looked up, meeting his pale gray eyes. She saw the exhaustion there, but also something else, a deep, resonant emotion that had been held in check for what felt like a lifetime. He reached out, his uninjured hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a gesture of profound tenderness that spoke more than 1,000 words. He was no longer just a stoic provider. He was a man revealing a long-guarded vulnerability. Later that evening, the cabin was quiet again, the fire casting a warm, secure glow. Silas sat in his chair, watching as Alara rocked a sleeping Leo in her arms, humming a soft, wordless lullaby. The scene was one of simple, hard-won peace. Family, not one born of vows and ceremony, but forged in snow and silence and shared peril. She looked so right there, in his home, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. She was not the broken, desperate woman he had found by the wagon. She was resilient, strong, a quiet force of nature in her own right. He had saved her from the storm, and she, in turn, had saved him from a solitude so complete he had forgotten it was a cage. She filled the silence not with noise, but with life. He had spent years believing that to care for someone was to invite pain, a lesson learned long ago and brutally reinforced. But watching her, seeing the fierce love she held for her son and the quiet strength in her eyes, he knew that the greater pain would be in letting her go. He stood and walked over to her. He knelt so his eyes were level with hers, and gently placed his hand over hers where it rested on the sleeping baby. Leo's tiny fingers curled instinctively around his thumb. Alara looked at him, her expression open and questioning, ready for whatever came next. A lifetime of solitude and caution warred within him, and lost. "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice a low, rough vow, barely more than a whisper, but it filled the entire cabin. He looked from her eyes to the child nestled safely between them. "I'm not afraid of loving you." It was not a question seeking an answer, but a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that had settled deep in his bones. Alara felt the last of her own fear dissolve in the warmth of his gaze. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time, it was not one of despair. It was a tear of release, of homecoming. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a silent acceptance, a promise given in return. The world outside was still vast and unforgiving, but it no longer held the same terror. Here, within these four walls, warmed by the fire and the quiet strength of this man, she had found her shelter. They were a small, unlikely constellation in the immense darkness, and for the first time in a very long time, they were not afraid of the light.